Hello aspirants and welcome again to Legacy IS Academy. So here we continue with our economic survey series, moving on with chapter 5th, which is related to inflation. The name of the chapter is Inflation Tamed and Anchored. See, if you look at the previous year's economic survey, it mentions about the reasoning as to why inflation is there in the economy, because at that time the inflation was quite high. But in the present fiscal year, India has managed to overcome the inflationary scenario. That is why it is mentioning that inflation has been tamed and anchored, means it is now going to be remaining stable well within the limit that is targeted by the RBI. So this is what it is all about. Before we go into the detail of that, we will look at certain terms and definitions which are a part of this chapter, which is very important, especially with the prelims perspective. So let's get started with respect to the terms and definition. So you have four very important terms and definition that is talked about in this chapter, that is headline inflation, core inflation, deflation and disinflation. So first let us understand what is inflation in general. So inflation is basically the increase in the general level of prices. Now this increase in prices is not just in one commodity, because when you measure inflation you take into consideration a basket of goods and services. That is why it is going to be an increase in the general level of prices for a sustained period of time. It needs to be sustained also. Why? For example, if there is an increase in price today, but 2 days later it falls down again, it's not inflation as such. It needs to be sustained for some time, for example, a quarter or two. So it is the increase in the general level of prices for a sustained period of time in the basket of goods and services. For example, the rural basket consists of 440 goods and services and the urban basket consists of 468 goods and services. This I am talking about with respect to CPI, that is Consumer Price Index. If you take into consideration the wholesale price index, it consists of 697 goods. So here we talk about goods and services both in the CPI, whereas in WPI it is simply the goods, simply because in CPI you measure the fluctuation in the prices at the consumer level, while you measure the fluctuation of the prices at the wholesale level in the WPI. Now in a wholesale you don't buy services as such in wholesale. For example, tourism, for example, the salon services that we get, do we buy it in bulk, store it and distribute it? Absolutely not. As a result of which the wholesale price index does not include the services. Please remember that. So this is the concept of inflation. Now here we are talking about headline inflation, core inflation, deflation and disinflation. So now let us have a look at these one by one. So in headline inflation, how is it different from core? Let us understand that. So as I said, in your CPI you have the goods and services both. Now in these goods and services you will have different things. For example, you will have food, non-food items. So in this CPI, for example, you have food plus energy as well as other items that are there. So what you do is, in this headline inflation you will have all the kinds of goods and services, which includes food and energy. These two are very important. Whereas when from the headline inflation you subtract food and energy, then you get the core inflation. So your core inflation equals headline inflation minus food plus energy. Now what is the thing with food and energy? Why are we removing it to measure the core inflation? So your mind may think that food and energy are core, so that should be a part of core inflation. No. Core inflation is not core with respect to the components that are involved in it. Then why is it so that you are removing food and energy? The idea is, the food and energy, these components are volatile in nature. That means their prices fluctuate quite frequently. Now, when in headline inflation, the food and energy is included, and since food and energy fluctuates quite frequently, you would not be able to assess what is happening with respect to the other goods and services. As a result of which, in order to understand what's happening with the other things, you remove food and energy from headline inflation in order to get core inflation. So remember, headline inflation is the inflation which is measured using including food and energy, whereas core inflation is the inflation wherein you subtract food and energy from headline inflation in order to get core inflation. I hope that's clear. Now let us move on to deflation and disinflation. Now, deflation is basically the opposite of inflation. Simply remember that it is the opposite of inflation. So in inflation, your prices basically increase. There is an increase in the general level of prices for a sustained period of time in the basket of goods and services. So what will happen here is everything remains the same. Instead of increase, it is basically the decrease in the general level of prices for a sustained period of time in the basket of goods and services. So it is exactly opposite of inflation. But then what is disinflation? Disinflation is nothing but the decrease in the inflation rate. Decrease in the inflation rate. That means inflation will still be there in the economy. It is just that its rate has declined. For example, if a commodity from 100 rupees is now being bought at 110 rupees, that means there is a 10% inflation in the economy. Now, a quarter later, after 3 months, let's say for example, this particular product is costing 115 rupees. Now you can clearly see that the prices have still increased, but what has happened is the rate of increase of the prices have gone down, and now here it is approximately 5% only. So is inflation there in the economy? Yes. But hasn't the inflation rate gone down? Yes. So inflation still being there, but the rate of inflation has gone down, which is nothing but the concept of disinflation. So these are the important terminologies which you should know before you start going through this particular chapter. Now let's get started with respect to the details that are mentioned in this chapter one by one. So here the first thing that you see is the trend with respect to the global headline inflation. So here you will see India as well. Then you have the advanced economies. Advanced economies inflation is quite less, but India has also gone down in inflation. Whereas if you look at the emerging market and developing economies, it is still quite high, and it was the one which reached the highest, and the world average is again a bit on the higher side. So if you look at the period around about 22, so China whose inflation is almost zero over here, so its inflation in 2022 was also quite less, around about 2%. India on the other hand was on the higher side, it was above 6% mark, whereas the emerging market is going to be even higher, almost close to 10%. However, since then, India has seen a decline, and right now we are at 2.8, lower. We are also emerging market and developing economy, but we have inflation less than the average of the emerging market and developed economies. In fact, our inflation is comparable to the advanced economy as such. And which inflation are we talking about? It is the headline inflation that we are talking about. Let's move ahead. Next is the global food and oil inflation trend. So here you have taken only the food into consideration. So when you talk about food, that is in blue, and oil, that is in orange. So you have food inflation which was considerably high. This is January to December of 2025. So it was quite high and almost at 7.5 to 8%. You can see this is at 8% over here. But India, since you can say since July, August, has managed in almost less than half a year to bring it down to minus 2.4%. That means See, this is what? This is a part of disinflation, as I have explained. This over here is basically disinflation. But right here you can see the inflation percentage is in negative, which is nothing but deflation. So we are actually seeing deflation when it comes to food. Interestingly, when you look at the OPEC basket of oil prices, the oil prices have gone down. This is minus 23.9. Then it increased, but they have remained in minus. That means they have remained in deflation. So oil prices, OPEC's oil prices has been continuously in deflation. This is a fact which you can remember. Percentages are not important for you to remember for the examination. Now, if you look at the change in the inflation, so this talks about the change in the inflation rate in the major economies, and it is year on year 25 compared to 24. So India has basically managed to change inflation, or you would rather say reduced inflation considerably. We have basically reduced inflation by about 2%, whereas certain other countries, let's say Japan, Brazil, United Kingdom, there has been an increase in the inflation, whereas as far as major economies are concerned, India is the economy with the highest reduction in inflation. So that is again an important thing which you can remember for your exam. Next is the average annual headline inflation for both WPI and CPI. Now many people get confused at times thinking that the WPI can never be more than CPI. That is absolutely incorrect. There is no relation which you can say for sure. You cannot say CPI will always be more, always be less, or equal to WPI. Absolutely not. They are two independent things. They have different things in their basket. Depending on that, you will have to check what is more at what time. And this diagram or this graph is a clear indicator of that. WPI is generally less than CPI. You can say generally the trend, based on the trend, it is seen that WPI is lesser, but there is no theoretical or even practical certainty about that. However, if you look at this, this is talking about the annual average. So you had a situation where in 22-23 roundabout, wherein WPI was higher and CPI was lower, but then there is a considerable decline in the WPI, which also went into the negative, and CPI still remain quite high. And right now also WPI is lower than the CPI. So why this graph is important? For you to know that there is no certainty as to which indicator would be high. That's point number one. And point number two is that in the last 5 years, if they ask that WPI has always been lower than CPI, that is also incorrect. There was a situation wherein it was higher than the CPI. CPI is Consumer Price Index, which basically measures the inflation or the rate fluctuation at the consumer end, whereas WPI is the measurement of the rate fluctuation at the wholesale price or the producer's end, is what you can say. Let's move on to the monthly CPI, that is headline, core and food. Now, without going into depth of the graph, can you tell me what will be high for India, headline, core or food? See, it will be the food one that is there, which would be higher. Now, once we have stabilized it, of course, the food one is the lowest. But it was the food one which actually went the highest, because of which there was high amount of inflation, because of which second will be your headline inflation, because food is included in that, and the lowest would be your core inflation. So at the time when inflation was highest in India in the last couple of years, food inflation was at its highest, then the headline inflation, and then the core inflation, which you can see over here. So this is your April 2024. This is the food inflation that we are talking about, which is on the higher side. Then you have the headline inflation, which is on the second higher side, and core inflation was down because core inflation includes excludes the food which was at a higher level. Right, so it remained the case till about the beginning of 2025, but since then we have managed to bring down the food inflation, because of which the headline inflation has also come down. So now we are in a situation wherein food inflation is the lowest then headline, and then core inflation. So this sequence is what you should be remembering. Let's move ahead. Let us have a look at the headline inflation for the rural and urban area. Now again, there is not a certainty in order to say that rural inflation will always be high, always be less, or equal. They can also change, which this graph clearly represents. So at the time of high inflation, it was basically the rural inflation. The rural inflation and urban inflation is quite neck to neck is what you see, but the rural inflation would slightly edge the urban inflation. See, it was high here, it went down slightly, but then again high here, high and higher and higher and higher, till the beginning of 2025. It was majorly higher. But was it higher throughout? No, because there are certain places wherein it was slightly low, but majorly high. Now what has happened is rural inflation has gone down and urban inflation is still quite not quite high, comparatively at a higher level. Now, why is that the case? See, because our food inflation was quite high, the rural basket has a good weightage of the food which is there, because the per capita income of the rural India is lower than the per capita income of the urban India, as a result of which the weightage for the food in the rural basket is higher than the weightage for the food in urban basket. That is why you are seeing this. But now since the food inflation is in the negative, that is why the rural India's the headline inflation is seen to be lesser. So you can connect that scenario. Now this is basically your core inflation comparison of rural and urban India. Now if you compare the core inflation means you will be excluding food and energy. So when you exclude food and energy, then what you see presently, if you look at headline inflation, presently rural is lower, urban is higher. But if you exclude food and energy, then the rural is higher and the urban is lower, because the negative food inflation which is going on, that means deflation which is going on, that impact will be removed. So rural is still seen at a higher side than the urban inflation. So the numbers as such are not that important. What is important for you to remember the trends that are there. Another important thing is to understand the reasoning behind it. So our food inflation was high because of the decline in the production of the food crops, especially the vegetables, in which especially the tomatoes, onion, etc. So what had happened in the last few years? So if you look at the data of the heat waves in 24, 23, 22 and 21. So in 2021 we had around 30 heat waves, 2022 also we had 30 heat waves, in 2023 the heat waves number went to 74, and in 2024 also it was quite high, it was 73. So you can see that the heat waves this year is more than double the previous years, and the production of these crops in the states corresponding to high number of heat waves was drastically low. So the production was drastically low. When the production is low, the prices are going to go up, and that is exactly what happened. However, the previous year's economic survey had predicted that the inflation, food inflation and the headline inflation are going to come down. Why? Because these heat waves were, of course, because of climate change, that is one thing, but in addition to that, the phenomenon of El Nino was present, because of which high temperatures were there, and it was supposed to reside, and La Nina supposed to come in, which will lower the temperature. Low temperature means low heat waves in the year 2025, leading to higher productivity, and higher productivity means more supply, so the prices would come down, the food inflation will go down as we have seen, which will also lead to decrease in the headline inflation, and the inflation would be in control. One thing that you should remember is the RBI targets inflation, and its targeting is 4 plus minus 2%. That means 2 to 6% is the target. Now RBI has reviewed its targeting and has given out an analysis saying that this inflation targeting is a good range, So we need not change it right now, but remember in the future RBI has said that this range can reduce and it may become 3 to 5%. Right, it can reduce it to 3 to 5%. It can lower the range. How will it be able to lower the range? It has given a reasoning also. It has said that in CPI, which we are targeting right now, food inflation percentage or weightage is considerably high. It is about 46%. Now when India's per capita income will increase, the percentage expenditure or spent on the food is going to go down. Now food which is highly fluctuating, when the weightage of the food goes down, you will be able to target inflation in a narrower range also. So in the future we can see this to be targeted, but right now 4 plus minus 2% is the right range of inflation targeting is what RBI has said. So that's about it in this chapter. Stay tuned with Legacy IS Academy's YouTube channel. You can subscribe it, hit that bell icon so that you get the notification of the next chapters coming your way. Thank you.